Hello and welcome to GCSE Biology topic B7 Ecology. This tutorial will cover part 1 adaptations, interdependence and competition. The rest of this topic can be found in other tutorials. Starting off with just some key words that we'll be talking about in this topic. It's important that you know what they mean. Habitat is a place where an organism lives. Population is the number of organisms of one species in a habitat. Community is all those populations of different species in a habitat. So what's an ecosystem? Well, the ecosystem is the community within a habitat interacting together, including the living and non-living parts of the environment. We'll come back to those parts later. You also need to know about food chains later on in this topic. In any food chain, you have a producer, which is the plant at the start of the food chain. The reason it's called a producer is because it makes its own energy from sunlight during photosynthesis. Then we've got consumers, and depending on where they are, primary, secondary or tertiary consumers, they consume other organisms. Herbivores only consume plants and carnivores consume animals. We'll also be talking about a term called biomass, and that's the amount of living mass within an organism. So what is competition? Well, organisms have to compete to survive. They can either compete within the same species, which is intra-competition, or with other species, inter. And animals compete for things like territory, food, mates, as in a sexual partner. Plants, they compete for light, water, minerals and space. Now, in a community, all of the species of an organism depend on each other and they all interact with each other. That's called interdependence. And that means in an ecosystem, if one thing changes, it can have a huge impact on everything else. So say, for example, in a food web, the population of one part decreases, it can have an impact on other parts of the food web, even if it's not part of the same food chain. Here's an example of a woodland ecosystem. Even in a woodland, you'd have animals living in the soil, like bacteria, earthworms, woodlice, fungi. You'd have things living on the trunks. You'd have animals living in the trees themselves. So there's different animals, different populations of different species all living together. So going back to those living and non-living factors. So non-living factors that affect a community are called abiotic factors. So anything that's not alive. So these are more levels of things. So like the amount of light, the amount of water, temperature, wind, carbon dioxide, oxygen, pH of the soil. And these can change population sizes. So for example, here you can see with different pHs in a river, there's different organisms found. So pH of around 4, there's a lot of frogs being found and so on. In this graph here, you can see that the height of plants changes as you go from the top of the shore. So that might be to do with light intensity or another factor. Biotic factors are living things that can affect a community. So a new predator being introduced, competition from other things, other organisms, diseases, the amount of food because other predators are taking him. And again, this can affect population. A really common example is red and grey squirrels. Now, they both compete for survival, but there's more grey ones, and that's because they're better at competing than red squirrels. They're better at finding food, they're better at surviving. And that means the red population has gone down as a consequence. So that's an example of a biotic factor affecting things. So what do we mean by adaptation? We talked about it when we looked at natural selection. So any feature or characteristic a living thing has that allows it to survive in all these different environments in the world is called adaptation or adapting. And you can split it into 3 things. So structural adaptations are when it's part of the body that's changed. So it might be camouflage or having body fat or having spikes, something for protection, for example. Behavioural adaptation is to do with how the organism acts. So migration's an example. And then functional is to do with the body's link to life processes. So bears hibernating in the winter, the reason they do that is to lower their metabolism so they can rest when there's much less food in the wintertime. Even microorganisms like bacteria can adapt. You'll find bacteria in the deep, darkest vents of the deep sea and in hot volcano vents because they can adapt in any of these conditions where it's high pressure or high temperature, and they're called extremophiles because they can adapt in extreme habitats. Okay, there's 2 questions here. I'd like to pause the tutorial and give yourself 10 minutes to answer these. Okay, 3 adaptations of a polar bear. Now there's obviously numerous, but I've just come up with 3. The thick fur and blubber, and don't forget to say why, so to retain heat or to keep warm. White fur for camouflage, and that's against prey, so the prey won't see the polar bear. The feet have a large surface area to be able to walk on the snow. There's other features you could talk about as well. They've got very strong limbs to be able to catch prey. For example, polar bears can get prey from the water, and so on. Question 2, name one abiotic and one biotic factor that can impact the population of plants. So what living thing and what non-living thing can affect plants? So the living things that can affect it would be other plants, so competition from other plants, say for example competing for light. And then abiotic factors would be the amount of light or the pH of the soil or the amount of water, rainfall, etc. So there's quite numerous things you could say for that one as well. So in summary, we've looked at competition, abiotic and biotic factors, and adaptations.